and we are joined now by Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history and Italian studies at New York University, who wrote a piece on the far right's victory in the Atlantic, the far right's victory in Italy, I should say. The piece is in the Atlantic. It's called The Return of Fascism in Italy. Ruth, thanks so much for coming on today.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
So, Giorgia Meloni, let's just start there. Who is she? How did she get her political start? She's been described as neo-fascist, which is often a way to talk about this group of far right-wingers that are rising in Europe. But just talk a bit about her political rise and what she represents within the Italian political context.
Yeah, so she's there's lots of far-right leaders in power in the world right now, you know, Viktor Orban, Modi in India. But she is different because she comes directly out of this neo-fascist party, which was founded right after World War II when Mussolini, died and fascism went up in ruins and the official fascist party was banned. So they founded this neo-fascist party to keep the ideals of fascism going. And this is where Meloni got her start. And I want to emphasize that she is a hardcore neo-fascist militant. She joined the party at 15, and by the 1990s, she was already the head of the youth organization, the youth wing, which is a big deal, national position. And she's remained in this party, the whole time. And indeed, the Brothers of Italy, which is the party she's in now, it was formed in 2012 because there was no longer an autonomous extreme right party in Italy. And when they were selecting the logo of the party, you'll notice if you look at the logo, it's got a flame in there, a tricolor flame. And she's now attempting to say she's a conservative and she's just a patriot. And so you could think that the flame is the colors of the Italian flag. Well, that flame is the original logo of the neo-fascist party, and she insisted on keeping it in there. So she's very connected to fascism and its post-war history.
Yeah, and there are a lot of right-wingers trying to say that she's actually center-right here in the United States, reframing that context. But, she's on record, as you say, she's been an activist since she was a teenager, age 17, I believe, speaking about how she has this regard for Mussolini openly. Yeah. And talk a bit about the Brothers of Italy's kind of meteoric rise there, because as you say, if it's founded in 2012, I saw it was polling somewhere around 4% in 2018, and now it was polling at 23% earlier this month, as you write, but now it's going to be the largest component of this ruling conservative far-right coalition. How did that even come to happen?
Yeah, so there are many right-wing parties in Italy, which is in part a function of the weakness of the center-left. And so what we're dealing with now, this coalition, so she's in power with the League of Matteo Salvini, which is an openly racist, far-right anti-immigrant party, and Silvio Berlusconi used to be prime minister, his Forza Italia party. And these are right-wing parties. And so, the history is that her party rose as these other parties descended in popularity. And Matteo Salvini is so extreme, and he's very incautious. He's a bit of a demagogue. And in 2018, which is when his party was doing better, he called for, quote, mass cleansings of immigrants. And he's been up on criminal charges for turning back immigrants' votes, causing human rights violations. So his party has descended and hers has risen. And they share many things. You can find video of her saying we shouldn't have any new mosques built in Italy. We should only have Italian spoken in Italy. She's a total conspiracy theorist. So she plays to fears about immigration as ruining white Christian civilization. And she's actually even to the right of Tucker Carlson, if that's possible, because it's not just, she doesn't just say that like demographic change is creating, fewer white babies. She actually many times has tweeted and said, there's a plot or a plan by George Soros and by the EU to actually flood Europe and Italy with mass immigration, and that's how you're going to get rid of white people. So this is who we're talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Tucker Carlson there. He seems to be, same with him and Steve Bannon, who she has a connection with as well, and I'm wondering if you can expand on that in a second. But the elevating of leaders like Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro to another extent, or here Meloni in Italy, their focus of like their political actors, these right-wing pundits, and Bannon and Carlson, and they seem to try to make these far-right politics be transnational in the way that they speak about globalists, aka Jews, and how that relates to the EU. Can you talk about how interconnected this ideology is, and how, frankly, deliberate it seems?
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. And since I'm a historian, I got to put the historical thing in, that fascism originally was always like, it had both things. It was hyper-nationalist, like Italy first, Germany first, but it was always transnational. And there were all these networks. It was called the Fascist International, trying to create this new order. And I have been seeing this coming about and tracking it, actually. And we see a far-right international, whether we want to call it Fascist International 2.0 or not, with a hub in Budapest with Orban. And there are all these exchanges. And Meloni is very central to these. And it's very interesting. She gave an interview to the Washington Post recently, and she said very matter-of-factly that she sees the GOP as part of this far-right international. And she said their battles are our battles. And so she's been to the National Prayer Breakfast. She's been to CPAC. And each victory, each person who's placed in power legitimates the movement as a transnational force and gives momentum to it. And so that's why Bannon is advisor to Bolsonaro. He's an advisor to Meloni, and he's advised her to tone down, some of her rhetoric and try and be accepted as a conservative. And so there is this, it's quite underreported, the extent to which these links have spread throughout Europe, and also the US part in it. And so for those who still struggle to accept that the GOP is a far-right authoritarian party, it's really interesting to hear Meloni just say in a normal tone, yeah, the GOP is part of it.
I mean, right, exactly. We're buddies. And this being transnational and part of a larger European trend is also notable. I mean, she's spoken at Spain's extreme right Vox party, I guess some sort of convention, but they've praised her. Marine Le Pen is said this is a big deal. She's a fan of it, and we've seen what's happened in Sweden with this far right, neo-Nazi connected movement. Mm-hmm. How just to build off your point about this fascism 2.0 movement being transnational, how also is it connected within Europe and in relation to the EU?
So it's, I think the grand design is ideologically, politically, is to, obviously, they're all very against the EU. Now you have cases where Orban, I think Orban should be kicked out of the EU at this point. He shouldn't be getting EU funding, but he is. And so the EU has actually taken steps to be able to sanction people like Orban who are ruining democracies by reducing their funds. That's a very interesting new development. We'll see if they have to use that with Meloni or not. But there is this design to create this other, just like the new order of the original fascism, to create this alternate political and social order, which is, again, transnational and is opposed to Brussels, is opposed to the EU. Now, how they're going to do this is unclear, but if given the power and the capital of America, if the GOP is able to take over in the next years and return someone to the White House, you can imagine how much more power and geopolitical clout this emerging 2.0, far-right international would have.
And Meloni's often been compared to Marine Le Pen, but they both share the same gender, and they're both extremist far-right wingers. Can you talk about how, I know Meloni has an anti-abortion stance, in addition to her extreme anti-migrant, anti-LGBTQ stance. So that is something that she shares as well with the far-right Republican Party in this country. But for those two in particular, you talk about it in your piece as gender washing, what they engage in. How does that look for both Meloni and Le Pen?
Yeah, so this concept, it's not mine, it's from political scientists who work on gender. And gender washing is when you have female politicians who use their, quote, softness. And if you look at, both Le Pen and Meloni, they dress in understated clothing, a lot of pastels. They look very non-threatening, although Meloni is when she speaks, she's a bit of a demagogue. Le Pen's more careful. She's older. Le Pen is older. But they use this kind of female presence to both say they're going to be friends of women and women's rights. They're both into what Meloni calls the natural family, which is a man and a woman. So no same-sex unions, no same-sex adoption. And gender washing is also where this facade of softness is used to distract from the absolute brutality and racism and real-world violent consequences of their rhetoric, right? So if we look at what has happened in places where Brothers of Italy is already governing, like in the city of Verona, it was declared a pro-life city. And she has made it more difficult for women to access abortion rights and to exercise their rights of reproduction and to get, morning after pill. And all this is very familiar in the US context. But it's a really big deal in Italy because Italy is different. The Catholic Church is inside Italy as a sovereign entity. And abortion rights were very difficult to gain. In 1978, after a long battle by feminists, they got the right to abortion. And Meloni says she's not going to go after that. But there are ways today, just as you don't ban elections, you just game the system and use all kind of trickery. As you see the Verona example, there are ways to keep abortion a right, but make it very difficult to exercise that right.
And so do you think it's just very quickly a distinct possibility that this happens more on a national scale within Italy, a significant rollback of abortion rights? Okay. Yeah,
in a way that again will be subtle. Now it's in Italy because the 1948 Constitution was all about preventing a demagogic centralization of power like fascism. The regions and the local government have a huge amount of power. So we'll really have to see what happens. But what's been disturbing is that in this election, places like Tuscany that have historically been left-wing all the way back to the pre-World War I days, the center-left is losing ground. So those local governments may be changing in ways that are going to benefit Meloni's coalition.
All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time. Ruth Ben-Ghiat, professor of history and Italian studies at NYU, and you can read her piece in The Atlantic, The Return of Fascism in Italy. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.